Hello, everyone. Welcome to this week's Bounty episode of the Day Zero podcast. I'm Spectre, with me is Z. Before we get into topics, we'll announce the winner of the free digital copy of Bastian Gruber's Frusted Web Development book from the giveaway we started running on our Discord last week from when we had him on our podcast. And that is Dark Soul from our Discord. So we'll DM you with your code after the show. Thank you to everyone who participated in it. We would like to remind everyone that we still do have the 30% off coupon code. For everyone to use if you still want to get a copy of the book or any other book by Manning Publishings. And that's Pod Day 021 for anyone listening. And you can get that in chat as well with the coupon command. So yeah, with that out of the way, we'll jump into our topics for this week. So multiple concrete CMS vulnerabilities was put out by Fort Bridge. These kind of detail race condition. The first one, at least, is a race condition in the file upload. And there's two race conditions here. So the first race condition in the file upload is for uploading images into the local file system of the server, or the S3 bucket. And that's because they do validation on the file after it's been downloaded locally on the server. So when downloading the file to do validation checks, they download the file to a temporary directory with a unique ID, which sounds good so far until you remember that you're dealing with PHP here, and unique ID is using get time of day to generate that unique ID, which is very predictable and brute forceable. So I guess
Well, it
what would you pin
depends.
this down to, Z? Would you pin this down to a race or a non-secure random ID? Because I can see you kind of going both ways on it.
Okay, so first, I do want to say, using unique ID, in general, globally unique IDs just they aren't necessarily meant to be non-predictable. They're meant to be unique. That's a common issue, not just with PHP. You kind of called out PHP there. I
That's
think a
fair.
lot of people just
Maybe that was unfair to
don't
PHP.
necessarily. Yeah, a lot of people just make that mistake thinking if it's globally unique, it must be unpredictable and random. I kind of think of this one as, on a whole, being a weak randomness issue.
That's what I was
I
thinking
mean,
too.
I get the argument for calling these race conditions. I'd still only say it's one race condition, being the fact that it's kind of the out of order performing of that check. Um, because I mean, the second race is just they're racing to predict it, which is still kind of the first. It's still kind of just one race, but that's a side note, really. It does that's just naming convention, I guess. But yeah, I mean, I see where they're coming from, calling it a race condition. It fits race condition. It's things happening out of order. It fits. But yeah, I think this one comes down just to that weak choice of randomness. Although the other big thing to consider here is you're writing files to the web root. That's also where this comes. So that's just a bad deployment setup. And the big issue here, it has a dangerous feature for one, which is the ability to give. So this is for limited users. They don't specify exactly, and I'm not familiar enough with Concrete and their general user account setup, but they have some feature here where you can go and provide a URL. It will download that file, pop it into the web root, at least by default. I have to imagine this is somewhat configurable with the predictable name. So putting it in the web root is itself another big issue because it's just creating a huge attack surface for any sort of bypass of their checks that, sure, they try and prevent PHP files from being uploaded. Somebody bypassed that and now they've got the code execution. Had it been outside the web root, had it been at least in a non-executable directory, like some that Apache or whatever wouldn't try and execute, the core issue would have been solved there. So, I mean, that's kind of just like a big no-no also, but that's not something that Concrete CMS exactly controls. That's the deployment that controls that. And of course, most people run with default, so it's kind of a mix of things here.
Yeah, so that's definitely a fair call out with not sticking the file in web root. That's something you've brought up before with some of the other topics we've covered. That said, the reason I would say this is more of a randomness issue or like an ID issue than a race is obviously in order to perform checks on the file, the server is going to have to pull that file somewhere, right? Ideally, it would pull that into a directory where it has isolated access to it, where nobody else can access to it. And that's kind of what you were saying with the web root. And then if it needs to go into web root, it can be moved after it's been validated, right? So, yeah. But if they had a secure random ID, while this would technically still be possible, it would be improbable to actually exploit. Because if you're using a proper long random ID, it's not going to be something that you can easily brute force.
Yeah,
Um,
well, on that front, the other partial issue here is just the fact that they even allow users to have control over the file name. And that might be necessary in some cases. I would say, after doing the validation stuff and you're moving it into position, then you maybe have to use the user's provided file name. But that is just another common practice, is to uh give it a completely random name also. And without that file extension, there's a good chance that something like Apache, however that's configured, wouldn't have decided to execute it either.
yeah, that's true. So, yeah, just kind of a weird issue that could be classified a few different ways. Um, but it mainly comes down to subverting the validation by getting your timing just right on when you upload your file and when you make your request, and that lack of randomness with the ID. Yeah, with what you were talking about with and like thinking that unique IDs are going to be random or like not predictable. I guess like I kind of made that mistake too when I was talking about it there, and I guess the reasoning for that is just when you're thinking about like security in the back of your mind, you're thinking about like a unique ID. Like uniqueness is used a lot in like trying to get a random number, right? So you kind of think it goes both ways with thinking I'm going to use randomness in trying to get a unique ID too. But yeah, you're right. You could just use things like the time of day and the date and things that are predictable to generate it as well. There's no like guarantee that it's going to be a secure random, but ideally it would be. Like I guess that this is probably not really a discussion we want to get into on like
Well, I mean,
what you
in
would
a lot
classify
of
as a good unique ID thing. I just think at the language level, if you can make a unique ID function in a more secure way without being so predictable, I think that makes sense. But
well, they have the flag for more entropy that could have been used,
yeah,
which then would actually use. I'm not sure if PHP random bytes is, and that's part of like PHP-C library. Not, I'm not sure if that's actually exposed, so I'm not super familiar with what that calls down to. I'm not sure if that is cryptographically secure in terms of the randomness, but
yeah, it's an interesting question. I'm not
there's
sure.
the option for getting more randomness involved there.
Yeah, so that's fair. You could pin that down then on just not calling it properly. So
No, and I guess also just talking about the exploitation here a little bit. So this dangerous feature, you're able to download any file. Big issue, or part of the big issue, it downloads the file, writes it wherever into this volatile directory that we're, so everything we've been talking about so far has been trying to predict the directory name that it writes into. Um had they sorry, I'm just trying to organize my thoughts a little bit, but with attacking this, one thing that is kind of note is that there was about a 60-second timeout on the actual curl request. So that did limit the amount of time that you had to brute forces. And in that period, you might also think like a million possibilities. So the only real randomness here comes from the fact that it's using the microseconds. It does use like the current the Unix timestamp, current number of seconds since the epoch. Uh, um, that's fairly knowable. Most servers you can grab that out of like the date header Depends on some configuration things, reverse proxies, all that. But in general, you can at least figure that one out. So, I mean, a million possibilities in 60 seconds. That's a lot of requests to send. If you're on the cloud, then you can get something in like the same region. You can hit pretty hard. They talk about using Burp's Turbo Intruder in order to actually get. I want to say they were talking about doing just under 16 to 17,000 requests per second using Turbo Intruder. So about 500,000 or a bit more in 30 seconds. So 50% chance of it working in that. And I guess I'll also add they did extend their window a little bit by having that request take a while before actually printing the file. Because it would create the temporary directory before making the curl request. Make that request. Hold that request open as long as you can, but not going beyond the timeout. Printing your file and leaving.
Yeah, so it would be a pretty noisy attack, I guess is what I would
I mean, who's reading
highlight from what you were
PHP
saying.
logs?
I'm sure there's some people who
Oh,
do,
there
but
are for sure. I
anyone
just
who
mean,
does read the logs would see it pretty easily.
yeah, I just mean there's a lot of these sort of CMS that are running that aren't really like it doesn't feel like the hardest of targets, you know?
No, and we've covered Concrete CMS in the past, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, look, it seems like a good target to look at if you're looking for something. But yeah, that said, we can move on to our next topic here, which is a threatnext post that talks about exploiting a bug in WebKit CSP to get a cross-site leak on destination URIs. So Z, I'll let you take this one away.
Yeah, and I really like this bug. It seems fairly minor at first. In fact, what ended up happening here is that Safari had this bug, or just WebKit in general. Had this issue, they reported it, and basically they just didn't see it as enough of an issue to actually fix. So they took it and went and got like over $100,000 in bounties because, I mean, if Safari's not going to fix it, might as well get some money out of it. So the issue itself being in content security policies. When you set that up, so that's, setting up basically what your website can load, what it can do. Complex enough that I'm not going to cover everything here. But the gist of it being that you can also set up, useful for like debugging a new policy, a location for any sort of failed validation to report to. So you can basically say like, hey, if something goes wrong, just report the issue to me at whatever location. And that'll send you information like what policy went wrong. And it'll tell you, or it should tell you the document URI, so just where were we when this went wrong. And the issue on WebKit was that it would actually, in redirects specifically, so if you were to have a redirect that resulted in the CSP violation, in that case, it would send you the report and the document URI would actually be the destination of that redirect rather than just being something a little bit less informational. So the idea with that one is that should be the page that actually spawned the redirect, not the redirect target itself. Also, other browsers will limit it to just being like the origin, I believe, like just the domain. But the fact that WebKit was leaking the actual redirect or destination URL made it kind of an interesting target here. So at this point, like, I can kind of understand being or feeling like that isn't really leaking that much extra information. But what they managed to do with this is abuse it against single sign-on setup. So commonly, with OAuth, you go through the authorization code flow. If a user's already authorized an application, when they hit the OAuth endpoint, it's going to see, hey, they've already authorized this app, and then redirect them with the code in the URL. So if that redirection were to cause a CSP violation, then the attacker would also get. Well, actually, I guess that redirect wouldn't happen at all in the first place. It would get stopped by a CSP, and then the attacker would get notified with the security policy, or sorry, with the violation event. They would get notified of what URL caused that problem, letting them know what that authorization code was. So they would be able to hijack any account that came through. It did seem like for WebKit, when they reported this, their misunderstanding was the thought that, well, this only impacts websites that actually set up a CSP that, is using this reporting feature and is doing all of that. But no, like an attacker can craft their content security policy to allow a fetch to that, to the OAuth domain, the OAuth provider, or whatever single sign-on, as long as it is crossing some domains. Um, an attacker could set up their own page, be like, hey, you can load this page, but the domain that it would redirect to, that you can't load. So, like Facebook and Instagram. You can hit the Facebook OAuth endpoint. You can't actually go to Instagram. So when you give somebody who's logged in on Instagram, you go through the Facebook thing, it'll redirect them. And instead of going to Instagram, it'll send them the alert letting them know the code. So basically leaking all of those tokens. So quite impactful. And an attacker could set up their own page to do this. They would require that the victim visits their own page. So that is, it's not a huge ask. Especially because this is untargeted, in the sense that basically just everybody who visits, they'll be able to pick up this violation event. They don't need to know the user ahead of time. And I guess the other thing is they have to actually be authorized, or they have to have actually authorized that application, at least for OAuth. Other setups may or may not, but they have to be logged in there is effectively what it comes down to, which again, not a huge ask, especially if you're hitting this on a lot of potential targets. But yeah, I really like this vulnerability just because it is such a simple issue. In terms of it's just exposing that little bit of extra information that doesn't necessarily seem too impactful, but it can be chained in order to compromise complete accounts because of passing information through the URLs.
So yeah, there is a bit of interesting backstory on the vulnerability as well, because this issue was kind of known about for a long time. I think the post mentions that there was something brought up about it back in 2013, and
Well,
that was
they
because
mention other things. So they mention other places. So using
so
CSP for like malicious intent has been known for a while, and being able to leak little pieces here and there. They talked about some Chrome issues, I believe.
yeah, so one thing they talked about here was this idea of allowing the URL in the CSP violation reports to be the like redirect URL, or the target URL. And that was an issue that was known about for a long time. Like there was a post that brought this up back in 2013, and so the specification was changed to recommend including the original request URL in the event message instead of the redirected URL. But WebKit didn't adhere to that changed specification. So it just seems like there was a bit of a um, like Safari or Apple kind of got lost a little bit in the specification changes, and because they didn't adhere to that change, that's what seemed to have led to this issue.
Well,
Um,
so the 2013, like, just to be clear, it is a separate issue from this one. Um, like it's leaking that in the blocked URI, not the document URI. So it's talking about you get the CSP violation, and it does indicate like what address was actually blocked. In the report, it'll indicate, among other things, it includes the blocked URI. It includes what the policy was, refer. It'll the violate directive and the document URI. So the blocked URI is what the 2013 thing was about and what some of the past research has been. What's novel here is this one, and this bug is in the document URI.
So what I'm referring to there is you can see this little paragraph here. Um, Therefore, further specifications of CSP was changed to recommend including the URL of the original request to the redirected URL. So that's the specification change I was talking about. And I expect that that change was brought on by some of those previous attacks that we were just talking about. So that's what I was trying to get at with the backstory there. But
Yeah, I'm just saying, like, these
they were
past
technically
issues,
in
though,
different
were
places.
a
Yeah,
different field. Yeah.
yeah, I see what you're saying. Yeah. Um, But yeah, like you said, Apple basically did a won't fix on this, saying this could be something to improve, but it's not something that poses a threat to WebKit users, but rather allows an attacker to use WebKit as a means to gather data about websites using the CSP reporting mechanism. They then continued to say, even after fixing this CSP issue, an attacker could gather the same information by monitoring WebKit logging while running an attacker-controlled build of WebKit. And this reply is really weird because, first of all, if you're running an attacker controlled build of WebKit, I think you have bigger problems than redirect URLs getting leaked. Comparing this bug to that scenario is not at all comparable in my mind.
Yeah, that's where I kind of made that reasoning that I felt like they were perhaps misunderstanding what the vulnerability was when I was talking
Yeah,
earlier about that. It was kind of that thought that they seemed to think that monitoring WebKit in that way is an equivalent.
yeah, it's a little weird. Um, the other thing that I found really weird about the reply and like their refusal to fix it is like this should be such an easy thing to fix. Um, like the specification outlines what the author is reporting anyway. So it seems like one of those things where it's like, why wouldn't you fix it? As a browser vendor, you're in the best position to protect everybody by centralizing the fix to the browser. You're already violating the specification according to the blog post here. And it's like just taking a quick look at it, it looks like it is violating the specification. So it does seem like one of those things like, why wouldn't they fix it? And they did eventually fix it after a year and a half. But they still refused to award a bounty on it since it didn't meet published bounty categories, in quotes. Um, but
Yeah,
yeah,
I mean,
before Apple fixed it, they used this bug to hit a bunch of single sign on various bug bounties, and yeah, like you said, they got like 100K plus from it.
yeah, so I don't want to spend too much time on this one. We've talked about Apple's bounty multiple times. This
That's
does
true.
feel like a good example case of what I was referring to in past episodes, where I've referred to how it maybe feels like Apple had this idea of, we're going to pay out for these impactful bugs, thinking that all these impactful bugs are going to be like, crazy, super elite hacks, not just like these little sort of bugs that do have a large impact or can be abused. Like, just that difference in I almost categorization where Apple can easily read this thing. This isn't that big of a deal in one sense. Obviously, it's impactful. I'm definitely not arguing against that. But just something that Apple wouldn't be thinking of as the type of bug they would be paying out for. But yeah, I mean, I don't want to spend too much time discussing that. It was just I thought this was a example of that sort of thing, and this seems to kind of be confirming that stance a bit.
Yeah, that's fair. I did just want to bring it up since it was like included in the article, and that was kind of the basis of why they went the route they did with exploiting the bug bounties. So I wanted to bring it up, but yeah, I wasn't planning to get into too much of a discussion around it.
Yeah, I mean, they probably got more money doing the bounties anyhow. And
Yeah,
to be
most likely.
fair, I will also shout they did wait a year before doing so.
Yeah, they gave him plenty of like breathing room. They
Yeah.
didn't just like report it and then a couple days later start using it on targets
Yeah,
to get bounties.
wasn't a week later deciding, yep, you've had long enough to patch this, and then hitting bounties. And most bounties actually for knowing bugs like that do sometimes have a time limit. Although in this case, I'm not sure how that would impact because it's not a patched bug.
Yeah, yeah, it's a bit of a weird case. All right, so for our last topic for the episode, we have a research paper called T-Reqs, which focuses on differential fuzzing for HTTP request smuggling. And yeah, it's basically what it sounds like. It's talking about fuzzing HTTP requests and various target pairings of entry points and exit points to find previously unknown techniques to cause a desync and thus request smuggling.
Yeah, and I mean, it
Which
is what it sounds like, but at the same time, I feel like the more interesting aspect here is less about the differential fuzzing. And
I
more,
agree.
I mean, so they did the differential fuzzing on kind of towards the end of the document. See if I can find it. They have these graphs. Sorry for those of you listening. That kind of indicate exactly what pairs were vulnerable to what attacks. Um, Kind of rough to read actually because they try and encode so much information into them. But more interesting, I think, is just the potential attacks that they explored and did find cases of. Because a lot of times, sorry to hijack this topic, but a lot of times when it comes down to request smuggling, like what we've been seeing recently has been that content length having a mismatch there and transfer encoding options. Um, that's kind of been how people have been introducing the desync between two servers or however many servers. Usually, we just talked about two. Uh, this has been looking at other ways, other places where you can create that desync and result in request smuggling. So I believe it's here pages 8 and 9. Yeah, looks like pages 8 and 9 actually. Yeah, page 7 also. They have this list of different discrepancies that they notice, things like distorting the protocol, invalid versions, manipulate termination. So like, using LF instead of CRLF or something like that. Uh, Using that sort of mutation on the document resulted in a desync in how the body or how the request itself was being parsed. And that opens up the attack surface quite a bit in terms of how many servers might be vulnerable. And it feels like the type of thing that you could script up if you're working on bounties. You could script up some that can test some of these requests and just toss it out whatever you're looking at, because while they do talk about these specific cases, odds are you're not, or pretty frequently, you're not going to know all the servers involved in processing your requests. You might know the front, you might have something leaking a little bit of like some middleware, but you're not necessarily going to know that. So it feels like one of those things you'd want to just automate, toss these test cases at it, and see what happens. They discovered these through just kind of a grammar based fuzzing. I don't think it's really necessary for anybody to follow up with just fuzzing that more. I mean, you definitely could. There's still more fuzzing that could be done there. But the differential aspect was largely just because you need a way to know when a request is good or bad, like to compare them in some way that's automated and know what the results should be. So using the difference between two different server pairs kind of gives you that.
Yeah, so I did want to talk a little bit about the methodology or like the
Sure.
implementation. So like you said, like their fuzzer T-Rex uses a context tree grammar to generate valid HTTP requests. It then applies two, I believe, of like a random two of these 16 different mutations that you were kind of touching on there in those valid requests. And it runs them through various target pairs and looks for discrepancies by sending a smuggler request with every mutation. And then it checks if the smuggler request was successful by seeing if the valid request was invalidated. So that was kind of um, their telltale of whether or not the request was smuggled through or not. And plays into the differential fuzzing. So yeah, like I said, there's a bunch of different mutation types here. There's like 16 different ones. They boil down into three different classes, being request line mutations, request header mutations, and request body mutations. The request body mutations wasn't too interesting outside of Akamai. It seems Akamai shows up the most in these graphs
I
between
mean,
like the discrepancies.
with a lot of them, like especially when it comes to the ones that were actually impacted here. So that is on page 10, I think. Yeah, server pairs affected by the request smuggling. Basically, Akamai is the main cause. Like, there is also this ATS, and there's a case here with Tomcat. But in general, Akamai was either the entry point, the first server, or the exit. But it was involved somehow. It was creating the issues.
It was the most common one for sure.
Yes.
And in the body mutations, it is the only entry point that had issues with it. So yeah, I found that a little bit interesting, especially when you're talking about Akamai, because um, like Akamai's main offering is security. Um, so it's a little bit strange to see them show up with so many like desyncs here, but perhaps that could even be part of the reason. Um, my speculation is maybe whatever they're doing with requests for like additional validation or something, maybe they're doing additional checking that other entry and exit points aren't, and that could be leading to the discrepancy. But like that's just pure speculation. It's just not one of the like products that they tested here that I expected to show up as much as it did in the results graphs. Because like I said, like Akamai is like kind of a security focused offering. So yeah, some surprising results in there, at least for me.
Yeah, I was actually also just a little bit surprised by the lack of diversity in the results. Um, like it was heavily Akamai ATS. I would have expected more out of some of the other pairs though. Just like there to have been more potential for desync. I mean, granted, still big thing being the content length and stuff, but like the usual attack vectors, basically. I expected to see more here. And that lack of diversity is a little bit surprising. But on a whole, I think the biggest takeaway of this paper is really the mutations there, just some ideas to toss at a target, instead of only trying the usual content length and transfer encoding.
Yeah, this is one of those papers where you can pull stuff out of it and kind of right away start using it in your own testing and stuff, and get some useful stuff out of it.
Yeah, and
It's one of the more practical papers.
I could definitely imagine there being some bounties based off this.
Yeah. I did quickly want to add on as well. There was a researcher from Akamai Technologies on the paper. So I kind of wanted to bring that up because it might have sounded like I was trying to go off on Akamai there, which is not what I was trying to do. It just caught me by surprise. But the fact that like an Akamai Technologies researcher is one of the authors of the paper means that they're aware of these results already, and that's worth keeping in mind because they might be working on making that less of an issue, or trying to mitigate it in some other way. So yeah.
Yeah, I'm like you said, I'm a little bit curious on why they seem to be kind of the problem point there because it's not like you were speculating earlier. It's not necessarily that they're somehow just more insecure. Because the thing with these desyncs is just like it's based on basically having a difference of opinion, um,
Yeah.
or maybe differing spec implementation or something like that. But I, I'd be interested in why this is happening. Basically, more information there. I doubt we're going to get it, but it is just a little bit interesting, and I wouldn't use this as a basis to like think Akamai somehow just inherently insecure. They're
No,
just
like
doing
I said, I think it's actually the opposite. I think it's that because they're offering security solutions, they're doing things that are outside of the specification. And yeah, like the desyncs here aren't because one thing is bad necessarily. It's just because it's doing
everybody
something
else is wrong.
differently. Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's a good way of putting it. That's kind of what my speculation is, but
Yeah, I
yeah,
mean it's not like the other things tested though are that strictly speaking like considered that insecure either. Like they had a good test bunch here, CloudFront, Cloudflare, uh usual proxies, Varnish, Squid, Nginx, Apache, Tomcat, like things you see plenty of.
yeah, they had a really strong target selection. for sure.
It's not like some of the fuzzing papers we've talked about in the past where we question why they're testing on these things rather than real targets.
Yeah, these are definitely real common targets, for
You
sure.
know, good paper. I did feel like, especially these graphs at the end, like it is a little bit hard to parse because they're trying to include so much information in it in just this very little graph. But on the whole, like it was a well done paper, I think.
Yeah. All right, so that concludes all the hard topics we have for this episode. Z, you have a shout out. I'll let you cover that, and then we'll move to wrapping up the show.
Yeah, just one shout out, especially because we are talking about ECC, elliptic curve, cryptography. It's a last bounty episode, maybe one before that. Very recently, on a recent episode, we were talking about that and the basically setting things to zero, passing verification. And during that, we talked about how it ECC isn't exactly an intuitive thing to understand. For most people, like it's not readily just immediately understood. So NCC Group has also put out a illustrated guide to elliptic curve cryptography validation, which is just a nice read basically about a little bit about what it is and how things can go wrong. So I just wanted to shout it out, not cover it in detail, of course, getting a little bit too math heavy, but it's enough information there that if you are kind of in the position to be reviewing some crypto code or doing some of the review on these things, you could probably benefit from looking at this if you're not. Actually, even if you are fairly familiar with ECC, it's just basically another perspective on things. So I want to give them a quick shout out.
Yeah, the timing on that post was like really good.
I mean, it's
Um,
probably related. That post was also from NCC Group.
yeah, it's a follow up, but yeah, I mean, like you said, that was like the main like a main talking point that we had was just like how unintuitive ECC is. So putting out a post that explains it a little bit, that could be useful to more of a layman, is yeah, this is a good looks like a good post. But yeah, that will wrap up the show. That's all the topics we have for today. Thank you to everyone who tuned in. You can catch the VOD on Twitch or on YouTube at 6 p.m. Eastern tomorrow. We also have previous podcasts up on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and more links on Anchor. If you want to join our Discord and follow us on Twitter, links for those are down below, and I'll put the link for Discord in chat. We'll be back tomorrow for our binary episode. That's at 7 p.m. Eastern, 4 p.m. Pacific, which is where we'll also cover the Spot the Vuln solution that was shown in the pre-stream. We have that in Discord as well for those who missed it and still want to take a guess at it. But yeah, with that said, we'll see you all tomorrow when we return for our binary podcast. Take care.